Yeah.
Welcome to another episode of Inspire People, Impact Lives. Today I'm excited to welcome Jon Eckhardt to the show. Recently we set out to find a guest who has a real pulse on the entrepreneur and startup community here in Madison. Someone who has really deep understanding of all aspects of entrepreneurship in today's environment. Someone who's dialed in and could really give our audience an in-depth perspective on entrepreneurship and where Madison is on the map. So we couldn't be more pleased to have Jon on the show with us today. Jon is a Richard M. Schulze Family Foundation Distinguished Professor and editor at the Entrepreneur and Innovation Exchange and a professor also here at the great UW-Madison. Jon is involved in leadership, research, and business. From 2012 to 2019, he was executive director for the Weinert Center for Entrepreneurship. Jon's involvement in business includes roles as a co-founder of the Generator Business Accelerator, which has helped to build over 85 companies now that have gone on to raise over $250 million in venture funding, and I think most importantly, employ over 2,500 people. So that's huge. He serves on profit and nonprofit boards and advises on entrepreneurship, innovation, and application of data science, which we can't wait to discuss, to business. He has given talks on entrepreneurship and innovation to business groups, including at business retreats and C-suite board meetings. Jon, with all that, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So before we get started, give us a little bit about your personal, professional background, and then we'll get right into the questions and get as much info out of you as possible.
Well, I grew up in central Pennsylvania, another Big Ten town, Penn State University, and I went to college there as an undergrad. But before that, I served in the Army for 3 years.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you for acknowledging that. For several years, and then I went to college and absolutely loved it. And I feel like for some parents out there that I'm not sure if their students are scholastically inclined, it can happen a little bit later in life and still turn out well, which is what basically happened in my case.
Yeah.
Afterwards, I went to work in finance first as a bond analyst for a mutual fund group, like Mason Wood Walker, which is headquartered in Baltimore. Cut my teeth reading bond indenture documents, which are super long, trying to find an edge there.
You stayed awake while reading those?
I did. I've always been a little bit of a financial nerd. And venture capital is a very, very different space, a very different set of skills. But in the end, everything that basically happens in the economy is driven by the return that people are expected to get, either as an individual investment or put together in a portfolio. And it often starts with the bond market, the largest market there is. So it was a fantastic experience, worked with a great team there. And then I transitioned to be an economic consultant for a year. And so I worked with a company that advised very large corporations in a variety of different roles. I worked in an antitrust group. So if you're a very large firm and you want to buy another large firm, you basically work with the federal government to try and determine whether or not there are anti-competitive concerns about that merger. And so I worked with a firm called National Economic Research Associates, which was, I think, one of the first, if not the first firm in that space, headquartered in Washington, D.C., mostly staffed by a bunch of very high-skilled economists that do that work. And then I went to grad school. I earned a PhD in business from the University of Maryland in College Park. And
another Big Ten school draft.
Another Big Ten. Well, what's been happening is, actually when I was a very young lad, Penn State was not a Big Ten school.
And neither was Maryland, yeah.
And neither was Maryland. And I feel like my entire career is in the Big Ten, but it could be every university at some point and still be in the Big Ten if I were to move again. So, but I do love the Big Ten environment. I do really like the academic institutions that we have that in most cases have almost every single topic known to humankind. We are a shop that has almost expertise in almost every single area. A lot of other schools, sometimes schools are even thought of as more prestigious than Big Ten schools, are often missing complete topics. And I think it's one of the advantages that we have for an institution like ours. We have a giant hospital. We have arts and sciences in almost every topic there. I think we don't have architecture, and I don't think we have school of dentistry. I think that's basically it, if you think about what a university could possibly have.
Yeah.
And so to kind of return back to the biography a little bit is when I was studying for my PhD, I really became interested in entrepreneurship. And for those of you that may have studied economics as part of your training, remember my first day in my PhD, they put this equation up on the board because most of your PhD training is working with math and statistics and trying to find ways to describe human behavior in math. Put this equation on a board which says output is a function of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And then 3 years later, like I hadn't seen entrepreneurship again. Like we had just set that aside and focused on labor and capital allocations and issues around that and like auction theory and how people basically behave. But the entrepreneur really has been absent from most of the fundamental work in economics since around the 1940s until most recently when it's been brought back. And so I became very curious about this. I ended up doing my dissertation was on entrepreneurship. I studied under a guy named Scott Shane, who's a fantastic scholar in the space. And when I graduated, I ended up here at the great University of Wisconsin with my wife, who's also a faculty member here now. And I've been I guess it's almost 15 years now. I've been a professor working in the area of entrepreneurship. And as you sort of mentioned earlier, part of me is I'm a statistician. I study essentially entrepreneurship using the tools of statistics. But I also really like to directly engage in the phenomena so that my scientific work is really informed by what people are actually doing. There are others that really focus more on the statistics side and they really invest heavily in writing research papers and they don't engage in the phenomena. They're also, I think, fundamentally important in our knowledge system. But I do think there's a value in having some of the faculty out there in practice in the field, trying to do stuff, having things blow up in their face and then try again. And as a result, like the science enterprise becomes connected with actually what's happening. And so you have people that have a good understanding of both. And so Generator is an example of that. Most recently, where I spent several years there helping to build that business accelerator, is a phenomenal experience for me, and a lot of things that I thought initially before going into it really changed as I was doing that work. And I've also used that in my more recent work, bringing it back into the campus. So that's basically me in a nutshell.
That's you in a nutshell. It was really good. I had a lot of thoughts as you were speaking there, and what I think most resonated, or what I wanted to say next was, You talked about econ and not addressing entrepreneurship. You have the macro and micro. I've been very public that I didn't finish my undergrad degree, but in my time in undergrad, I was on the general business side, and then we look at the finance side as well, where I took classes and started to get some of my want to go into the finance industry, but it was corporate finance, which was taught at the business school, and there was very little application to entrepreneurship or personal finance. It was all studying the numbers on the backside. So I found some corollaries there to what you were speaking to on the econ side, not really getting into entrepreneurship, not getting into the personal finance side of things. Now I know that UW-Madison has a personal finance side of things, and other universities are getting more and more into that through creating CFP programs and whatnot, but that wasn't popularized when I was in school either. So I'm glad to see there's some traction there. And then there's people like you that are seeing the community involvement in the entrepreneurship as well as the, educational or studious side, and seeing both sides. I think that's so important.
Yeah, really thinking, in the end that there's a variety of things that motivate people to study and to learn and to be curious. And for some people, they are just inherently interested in reading about the unknown without thinking about the application of it, because that's just how they're designed. To do a PhD, like at some point, I became that person also, just completely immersed in the material that I was studying for that material's sake. I think it's a wonderful thing about our society that we can have institutions that essentially reward that and celebrate that and enable that, because a lot of the discoveries that we come up with come from that kind of science where people are just intellectually curious. They come up with something new that nobody expected, and that benefits us all. But there's other ways of thinking about academia as well. And I think that there are some people that are really attracted towards using the knowledge that they're acquiring in the classroom or the tools of science to solve some immediate problem, something that's motivating them, some itch that they basically have. And I think that it's beneficial to our institution to have models set up where people can kind of be attracted to study on all these different mechanisms instead of just the one, which is basically you study for studying sake. And so I do think that your own personal journey, and I've spoken with many entrepreneurs that did not finish school because they really wanted to, sometimes they didn't know it quite yet themselves, but they were people that were a little bit different. They really wanted to do something out there right now. And at the time when they were in school, academia really wasn't providing them with an environment that it helped them pursue those goals fast enough, if you want to call it that way. And there have been some changes, I think, in the past. We have an entrepreneurship major on our campus. Now it's an option on our management major. And one of the things that we did is we set it up so it has the least number of credits required for a major, with the idea that we want to give these people some space. They're doing amazing things. We want them to stay in school as long as the material really speaks to them. But we're acknowledging that a lot of their learning can happen outside the classroom. We spend more time coaching them outside of the regular kind of 4-credit environment.
That's really good. So I know we've been talking on this environment of entrepreneurship. So can you tell us about, more broadly, the current environment in Madison as you see it, or I guess just broadly of entrepreneurship? But what do you see as the current environment, like with platforms like Kickstarter, GoFundMe, Instagram, YouTube? I probably missed some. But I have to imagine there's ways that which ways entrepreneurs start a business and go to market drastically different than they did 10, 20, 30 years ago. So what are you seeing from your lens, from the academia side, and then also your, in practice side?
This is a great place to start, and an important topic to highlight on, because the practice of entrepreneurship has fundamentally changed in my lifetime as a professor. So in the last 15 years, when I first started out, we just think about how businesses are financed, which is a major part of the story as far as what's changed. If you're an entrepreneur, you're a student entrepreneur in Madison, affiliated with a school or not, a university, if you wanted to start a company, you basically often would hit a point where you need to raise some capital so that you'd be able to build that product or service or reach your customers for the first time. Sometimes you need cash up front to get going. What you would typically do historically is you would go meet with a bunch of wealthy individuals in your community and try and talk them into supporting you. They were often, these meetings were with investors who are typically known as angel investors. They were often quite experienced business people in their own area. Maybe they were involved in banking or finance or something like that. Many of them were not entrepreneurs themselves, although some of them were. And you'd pitch them on this thing that you were trying to pursue, your new product, your vision, your idea. And they basically functioned as a gateway. And if you're able to talk that particular group of people into your vision, if you had enough relationships in contacts with people like that, if you were lucky enough to get an investment from them, then you'd be able to move forward. And if you didn't, you were basically stuck in the typical case. Entrepreneurship was financed very locally and regionally through people based on the expertise in the local region. And there are a lot of problems with that, and in part because people might come up with ideas that don't really resonate well with that particular group of people. Maybe you can't get a meeting with them, and so there's a lot of efficiencies. And what basically started to happen with the collapse in costs of conducting business more broadly is that we reached a point in the United States where it became much cheaper to launch a business than it was even just a few years prior to that. And so if you're going to start Yahoo, you had to raise millions of dollars to start a company like Yahoo. You can start a company that does exactly what Yahoo was doing. Not that I'd recommend that, but you could today for probably around $500. Okay.
Wow.
That's not counting the costs of putting together a legal organization and everything else, which max would maybe cost you $5,000, and that would be if you were really paying top dollar for something that you probably shouldn't. But you're going to get off the ground for literally pennies on a dollar versus before. And what that meant is that many individuals had access to being able to start companies, and they didn't have to go through that older process of working and having dinners and maybe knowing people. And the other thing I should mention earlier is that process was often quite slow. To get that meeting, it might be months before you got in the room, and then they'd have this wonderful dinner, and then maybe somebody would follow up with you, maybe they wouldn't. And so what basically happened is people were handed this because of the collapse in cost, because of all the investment that's been happening in technology and the positive effects of that. Entrepreneurship became quite broadly accessible to a lot of people. And what they would do is they would then finance these companies from themselves or friends, family members, in this quite low risk to give your offspring a few $1,000s so they can get off the ground and try and do something. But there was a kind of a negative attribute of that as well, is because what in the earlier model, if an entrepreneur was financed by an angel group or perhaps by a venture capitalist, which is another layer of professional investors that operate in the space, what comes with the money came expertise, knowledge of how to build a company, knowledge of contracting, knowledge of how to hire people, and that expertise would make these companies better. And the folks that were starting these companies on their own without the benefit of this expertise in many cases often found themselves going down a trajectory that was very difficult to reverse, that essentially meant that in the end that their company was going to be doomed, or they weren't going to be able to achieve their dreams because they didn't have these like professional investors on board. So what happened is that there was two groups of people, I'd say independently, although there was Y Combinator was the first one to start, came up with a new investment model. And the idea basically was to professionalize the earliest stages of venture finance. So those people that are just getting off the ground, like I mentioned before, with just a few $1,000s. And these were, in the case of Y Combinator, like experienced entrepreneurs that had been doing some investing. The other entity that really started this industry was a group called Techstars out of Boulder, Colorado. Brad Feld and David Cohen are like really the two people that are the most visible from that group more broadly in the community because of the books that they've written and things like that. They basically created a model where instead of doing a lot of due diligence when you're deciding whether or not you're going to invest in somebody, which was part of the process earlier with the dinners and the angel groups and everything else, which was rightfully probably done that way, because if you're going to make a large investment, you should be doing a fair amount of due diligence. Costs had gotten to be so low to start a company that it sort of didn't make as much sense to spend as much upfront time on due diligence, and instead basically you give people a check and see what they can do with it. Right? And so Y Combinator and Techstars was informed around that model, and basically what it did is they set up an environment where they had people apply as a cohort to participate in their accelerators, is the term that of art now that has come out. And you'd show up there as a group. Those that were accepted into would show up as a group. They would be trained by these really amazing entrepreneurs and by their network on how to build their company in the best way possible. And then they'd also be given very efficient introductions to investment groups that they thought would be the best for those companies, so their financing story becomes much more efficient. And as a result of that, you suddenly had this professionalization of the earliest stage of venture financing that didn't happen before. And as part of that, other entrepreneurs became aware of Techstars, which is originally in Colorado, and Y Combinator, which started in Boston and then moved to Silicon Valley. And you'd have entrepreneurs from all across the country applying to these entities. And so what started to happen is you were shifting from a very regional means of financing startup companies to creating a national market for the financing of these new startup companies. And with that came, and this is missed by a lot of people, but I think fundamentally important to understand, with this came standardization. So Y Combinator and Techstars and the other accelerators that would start, like Generator, which has had phenomenal success here, Wisconsin. It's one of the top 15 programs in the country. It was inspired very much by the Techstars model. What basically started to happen is that Generator would basically look and see what are the nationally competitive terms that are being given to entrepreneurs. What's a good contract to give to an entrepreneur so that the business is most likely to be successful, because these entities like Generator and Techstars and Y Combinator, they do well when the companies themselves do well. Yeah. So they started to have this standardization of terms across the country, driven, I believe, but mostly by these accelerators. And then all these angel groups started to respond, and they themselves, full of like really experienced business people that want to help companies in their region, really started to adjust their practices. And so what has essentially started to happen, or what is now happening, is that you have a national market now for early seed stage entrepreneurs. They're at the very, seed means like you're at the very idea stage of putting your company together. You have a national market for this. You have lots of different players now that are very sophisticated, that are competing with each other, and they're competing for the right to get an investment, for the entrepreneur to accept their investment. And they're also competing with investors to finance them. And so the whole system has become operating at a much better level of efficiency or quality.
Seems much more fluid.
Much more fluid.
And this may be too broad in general, but it almost seems like a national Shark Tank without being on TV. Because they have the competitive juices to go after what they think is best, or what they think has the best opportunity to make them money long term.
Yes, you could think of it as a national Shark Tank. And there's no like local version of Shark Tank, or it's harder for a local version of Shark Tank to be running that is not fair to entrepreneurs. Right. Essentially. And investors.
With that, does the professionalization get as granular as, say, HR, who to hire next? Because I know there's a lot of great entrepreneurs and great, even financial advisors that start like I did, that we are great producers or great inventors, but really shitty HR people and can burn some bridges along the way. And I'm just wondering, does the professionalization that you speak of, does it get as granular as that as they're building that business so that they can build an awesome team that helps bring as much value to the company as possible?
Fantastic question. And so there are lots of different models that operate in this space where some of these programs where literally they'll actually build a company by themselves and they'll staff it and they'll have kind of back office operations, HR functions and CFO services and things like that are kind of built into their, let's call it accelerator-like kind of model. Those comes with additional costs that can make it more challenging for them to function. So they have to make all the numbers work out. But I think that an often very common model is that you'll have, traditional accelerator models, you'll have the accelerator will do a very good job as far as recruiting great talent and getting them off the ground and getting their initial financing. And then their job is to basically attract people to help that company out that bring the skills that particular company needs. If it's a good accelerator, that the accelerator itself might not even have. And so they might, really hustle and work really hard to get the right investor on that cap table involved with that company who can then provide that expertise. And that's part of what they do. And the other thing that's really essential is that if you have the benefit of being operating in a community that has a lot of expertise, that engages with these companies, you can solve a lot of these problems. And so a very common story is you'll have a company that'll start, it'll just be a few, let's say college kids even, and they'll get a company off the ground, they'll have like some small amount of success. And there's no way that like a Fortune 500 executive it would make sense for them to spend their time helping those people out, right? They're just not there yet. It would just not be a good allocation of time. But if that accelerator is helping them out, and if they're continuing to build their company and make traction, as they continue to develop, they start to attract people of amazing capabilities that can help them with their HR issues, as an example, or bring on CFO services and things like that. And so what differentiates some of these communities is some of these communities have these resources. It's an environment where you do have people that understand, how to run companies as they become more complex. And they also have a culture of people being willing to pay it forward, to pitch in first and help out a company, build a relationship, maybe before that company can actually pay for those services. And maybe later on down the line, then there'll be more of a financial relationship. But some communities of kind of across the United States have that kind of culture that helps them along to address some of those problems. So to wrap back to your question, there are some people that are building organizations that have that all in-house. There are others that are sort of leveraging the community around them as part of the equation, so to speak, to help these entrepreneurs be successful.
That's really cool. So it's paying it forward, like you said, from success and probably some failures that they had along the way, to teach them to hopefully not make that failure or mistake themselves.
That's right.
That's perfect. So let's switch gears a little bit to how UW and University of Wisconsin, or specifically you, are playing a role in some of these startups and entrepreneurship.
So people often look to academic institutions as one of the central drivers of economic development. And I think it's important for people to understand two things or several things about universities. One is that our primary mission in general is to pursue the unknown, like a research university. And we're engaged in a practice of scientific discovery. And by doing that, what we basically do is we attract amazing talent to our region. Every university does this. Big 10 universities are basically machines that are built to do this. You bring in talent to a region. They're inherently very smart people. These institutions are competing against each other to come up with the next discovery or the next innovation in those fields.
Yeah, so it's not just on the football field.
It's not just on a football field. It is everywhere. In fact, I would say that we are just as competitive everywhere. In addition to being competitive on the football field, there's also a lot of collaboration between these institutions. And so I work with co-authors and other scientists across the world, essentially, that are located in different places. And that knowledge and information comes here. But we're first and foremost engines of discovery. And we also are an environment, because of that, where it's a good place for people to come and learn. Because this is where the next knowledge is being created. And it's really beneficial to be learning not only from the textbooks that exist already, but to interact with people that are working on writing and creating the knowledge that's going to be in the next generation of textbooks. And that's what makes a place like this really special.
Yeah.
And UW-Madison is one of the best at this game in the world. We're typically, ever since I can remember, been top 10 in federal research expenditures on our campus. That means there's an immense amount of research that's happening here that's not at other institutions. But in addition to all this, what basically happens in sort of the more traditional version of entrepreneurship and tech transfer tied to a university like ours is that because we are operating at the frontiers of so many different topics, sometimes people, an academic, a team of scientists, will come up with an insight or a discovery that has economic value. They disclose it to a tech transfer office. We have at Wisconsin one of the first tech transfer offices in the world. It's a very unique arrangement, and they've been very successful. They'll come up with an idea, maybe they'll secure a patent around it. They'll build a company around that, and that will lead to economic development, job creation, these other things that we look for from universities. Cellular Dynamics International is kind of one example of that I like to talk about, where it's a company that was started here in Madison based on our science. Ultimately went public and it was acquired by Fuji just a few years ago. That operation is still here in Madison. It's a wonderful thing. But my work at Generator really led me to learn how, really at a frontline basis, how venture capitalists and investors and entrepreneurs often think about entrepreneurship, and their approach is completely different. Where the scientific approach I talked about before is essentially someone came up with a new technology and then they have some ideas about whether it might be useful to society or not. That's a story where you have a lot of failures because people come up with lots of cool stuff that other people don't want to buy.
Yeah.
And entrepreneurship is about coming up with things that other people want to buy, and as a result, everybody is much better off. Like these iPhones, I just can't stop playing with my new iPhone. This is just a wonderful, amazing machine, and people worked hard to make me want to buy this thing. It's expensive. But if you think about how venture capitalists and investors and entrepreneurs often think about this, they're often thinking instead about opportunity. Like, look, I'm operating in a world, and there are people that need problems that need to be solved. And we solve those problems with other people that have the mindset and a desire and an energy to solve these problems. So you're actually starting in many cases with a need first, and you build a team around a bunch of people that have a vision around how to solve that need. Sometimes the insight of where this need might be an employee at a firm that realizes, wait a minute, like there's something that I wish I could buy and I can't buy. And they go to their boss and they say, hey boss, like we should do this. We should launch this thing. And their boss says, no, we're busy. This does not fit our vision. This employee leaves that company and says, hey, I'm going to build this thing and I'm going to sell it back to my prior company. Just to give you one example of what this is like. So if you think about how it applies to academia, well, a university like ours, there's about 40,000 people that are interacting with, studying almost every topic known to humankind. They're at the frontier. These people are learning the different knowledge from these different domains. Some of them would be fit for entrepreneurship.
Yep.
And that's really informed my most recent work. And so at the University of Wisconsin, I'm proud to say we're one of only 2 schools in the world that I know of that is essentially focusing on entrepreneurship in this way, basically trying to build a platform that's informed by data science that starts with students as being drivers of entrepreneurship and to try and find ways to get better at it. There are some great examples that should give you hope. And so if we look at across the United States, Bill Gates was a student that dropped out, started Microsoft, as everybody knows. I think Oracle is a very similar story. Facebook is a more recent example. These are people that were all in academic institutions at the time that these companies were started. UW-Madison, we have 2 great examples. One is Epic Systems, started by Judy Faulkner. She wasn't a student when she started it, but had recently graduated, and there's no university technology inside that company, so to speak. There's no patent when it was started, but her company was very much informed by courses that she took while she was on campus, including a class on use of medical, computers and medical information or something like that. And that company now employs over 10,000 people here in Madison.
And the spinoffs and the impact that company's had on our community as a whole is just enormous.
It's amazing. And in addition, they're helping to manage the health of over half of the patients in the United States.
Yeah.
It's incredible impact. Another more recent example I like to talk about a lot is Eat Street, because they hit check all the boxes as far as a company that was literally started by students. They'd probably be the first to admit that they really didn't know what they were getting into or what they were doing when they started. but they found themselves in an ecosystem that was willing to bet on them and support them. And they excelled in every dimension, and they run a company that employs over 1,000 people at the moment, and operations, I think, in every state. I'm not sure about Hawaii and Alaska, but incredibly large footprint doing online food delivery.
Yeah, so that's incredible, and UW has done so much. And I love the point that you're making of actually attracting entrepreneurs, because I spent a lot of time early on in my career. I was the college unit director. It was my first leadership role, and I would go out to campuses and speak to try and attract interns to our company, Northwestern Mutual. And one of the things I would ask is how many people, when they came into college, or whether they have this opinion now, want to have a fixed salary when they graduate, and versus how many people want to be on commission or be in an entrepreneurial, bet on yourself type role. Great. And it was probably 95 to 5% towards the fixed, or what some would say guaranteed money, which is natural. Probably most of their parents took that route, and we know statistically about 5% or less are cut out to be business owners in the American population, at least from most recent statistics I've seen. So I knew that going into it, but I would question them about, is it guaranteed? Is it fixed? And especially in that 08-09 timeframe when the market did crash, and we knew companies like 3M, like Best Buy, and many others that were laying off great employees, but they had to protect the bottom line or the stockholder or whatever it might be. And so I love the attraction to entrepreneurship, because I still think that there's many people that have misnomers or just miseducation or just have never seen, because they didn't have a parent in it, an example of what life could be like outside of a just 9 to 5 salaried type role. So I love that.
Yeah, I think your point about what does it really mean when you have that 9 to 5 job, and what did that mean maybe 30 years ago versus today? And I think that, what's very exciting about our environment is that literally, like, the economic power that sits in front of any individual in our country today is tremendous. What you can accomplish with like a laptop, some phone calls, you can start doing international manufacturing in China, without getting on airplanes and putting on a lot of suits and flying back and forth. And any of us can do that. What that means, though, is that there are many more agents of change, so to speak, that are out there that also threaten existing business. And those companies that are not nimble, that their managers are not plugged into the innovative economy, they do face some challenges. And there's another side of the coin here. And I think at those employees of companies and those managers and those firms that embrace this, the opportunity is almost limitless. For sure, there will be some change in winners and losers. But on the big side of it, there's so much opportunity, much more for everybody, including large companies. But not all companies are going to get on that. And so people that are thinking, I can do what my parents did, I can go work for a company and have a stable job, and understanding that there's it's called a social contract between us. That's a risky bet, I think. And then it's good for people to invest in skills, to be a little bit more dynamic, to learn how to be more entrepreneurial, so that they can be more likely to benefit from the upside of this and not get caught by the downdrafts. And the other part of it is really thinking about your own family or household as a business, and saving appropriately so you can handle some of the bumps along the way.
Yeah, for sure. It's a great point, since I'm in financial planning. Thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
That wasn't even me that brought that up. That was you. So that's good. So what is UW doing to, because it's so important, I think that they are doing, I want to talk about how it impacts the community a little bit. What are we doing to educate and retain talent here, to make sure that our talent that you guys are working so hard to educate and bring into Madison are staying here in Madison to create these great companies like Epic and like Eat Street?
So this is a great it's a great segue into a broader issue of what we get when we have a university like University of Wisconsin located in our state. So there's two things. One is for sure that we have an operation that makes the state more attractive for people to come here. But before I get to that, there's another piece of it, which is the connection that we have to the broader economy because people come here and they don't stay. And so let's talk about entrepreneurship, the area I'm most familiar with. There are lots, I would say that less than half of the students, probably much lower percentage, I'm sure the chancellor would actually know, of my students stay in Wisconsin. They go to other places. But they go to New York City, they go to Silicon Valley, they start companies, and then what do? It's a couple different things. first off, earlier in their career, before they themselves do well, if they're fortunate enough to do well financially, they provide an immense amount of expertise to our students. They Skype in, they make phone calls, they're texting me and they're teaching me new things about things that they're seeing out there in entrepreneurship, and they're literally helping to train our students to become more competitive. Secondarily, they invest in our school. If we do a good job in how we train them, that they return that oftentimes as far as investing literally cash, building buildings on our campus, and helping to become a much stronger institution. So there are good benefits to have a nationally competitive institution that is plugged in, just like the football team, and like playing in all the stadiums and bringing the great name of University of Wisconsin to all these different states, and I'm sure helping with recruiting across all of our majors. Having an institution that's good enough and does well enough where people come here and then they leave and then they do well and they reinvest both their time and their resources is partly what makes us great and helps the people that stay in the state. The other part of this is that entrepreneurs tend, despite the conversation we talked about where the market's becoming more nationally competitive, entrepreneurs do like to stay where they start their companies. They tend to be much less mobile than other people.
Yeah.
And that's in large part because as you start to build your company, you start leveraging a network of people. They tend to be within your region. And so to the extent that we are doing a good job hosting students that want to start companies while they're here and we're building programs that are attractive to entrepreneurs, we're going to have more people that are staying that are building companies in the state. And there are some great examples of this. There's one story I really like to tell is a gentleman by the name of Wes Schroll. And as you're nodding, you might know Wes. He's a phenomenal businessman and a great person. He's actually from the Boston region, and he was trying to figure out what school should I go to. Boston's an amazing place to be an entrepreneur. Everything is there. They have a very mature venture capital community, many really established and fantastic entrepreneurs. But he applies to Wisconsin. He comes here and we give him the campus tour and show him what we have here around entrepreneurship, and he decides to come here. And when Wes was applying, he already had a business off the ground. Like many entrepreneurs, they're trying several things before they find a thing that really speaks to them. So Wes comes here for the University of Wisconsin. And the short version of the story is that he's since now no longer with UW. He's working in town here. He has a venture-backed company called Fetch Rewards. That's doing incredibly well. He's employing people in the state of Wisconsin, and he came here because of the programs that we have in entrepreneurship. So very much the entrepreneurship side of what we're doing on campus to build an ecosystem and an infrastructure that makes it attractive for entrepreneurs to start companies is one of the ways that we as an institution attract people to stay here in the state.
That's great. So I know that over the next 5 years, Northwestern Mutual and its foundation will contribute $15 million to support an endowed professorship, if I could say that word, professorship at each university, fund research, expand university curriculum, and develop K through 12 STEM learning opportunities and pre-college programming. And Marquette, which I know on the basketball corridor is a very arch rival of ours, but and UWM will each get more than $12 million in data science education and research. So it's almost $40 million Northwestern's going to invest in the state. I'll keep working on them to get some money over to you in UW-Madison as well. But that's really exciting because our CEO goes out there to the press and says, we want to make Milwaukee and Wisconsin a tech hub just as much as New York City, Silicon Valley, and whether or not they ever get to be that big, who knows? But that's an ambitious goal from one of the state's largest employers to put out there. Are you seeing other investments outside of Northwestern Mutual, just like, maybe not just like that, but enough to try and attract and keep talent here in Madison and Milwaukee?
There is a mix of activities that are occurring within the city here in Madison and across the state. I'm most familiar with what's happening here in Madison. There's a couple of very large players. So we have, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we had essentially one venture capital firm that was operating steadily here in Madison. Now I think we have like 5 to 7, not having the count right on the tip of my fingers. And we've had some Very large players like American Family Insurance, for example, has built this whole operation called the Spark Building now. It's what's been called. And they have an innovation hub there. They have a very successful innovation group that's been engaging in the community. And they have a very prosperous venture capital group that has been making fantastic investments across the United States, also in Wisconsin. And by doing that, by being a national player in the space, like a theme of this conversation, that knowledge is here at home. And they're bringing that and they're helping the state. There's also, in addition to like Starting Block, which is an institution inside Spark Building, which is really running a lot of programs outside the university for the entrepreneurs in the community more broadly. There's a building called the Hovde Building, which I really like to show people. This is a building on West Washington Avenue. I believe it used to be the headquarters of like the local AT&T operation or the phone company. And this is a completely private building. There's no government funding involved in it, that's my understanding. And if you walk inside this building, you'll literally see floor after floor after floor of high-tech companies. It looks no different than when I travel to San Francisco. They've got like the foosball tables, and they've got the pets running around, and like people walking around in like flip-flops and stuff like that. They have all that, but more importantly, they have revenue, they have employees, they have profits. It's a legitimate stand-up on its own operation. And there are lots of individuals that are out there that are making capital investments to make environments that are hospitable, to make it more hospitable for entrepreneurs to operate.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's really good to hear for both Madison and Milwaukee and Wisconsin as a whole. Could you explain to our listeners why there's been such a massive move to data science? Because I think, for me, it was eye-opening to go to our LearnVest headquarters, marketing headquarters in New York City and see that. And by the way, they had a pet policy where they could have up to 3 per day because they had too many running around at one point. So I did notice that, and they had to check them in so they knew which ones were there. But that's besides the point. Talk more about the data science movement.
So it used to be, decades ago, for example, that if you wanted to use data to understand, economic trends, the dominant shop was the federal government. They had the best data. They invested immense amount of resources in the current population survey, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and census. Like that's basically where the information lied. And as most of us know now, we have these devices. We have cell phones. We're engaging on the internet. The real information now that tracks like our economic lives and the economy lies in the hands of private companies. That's just a fact of life. And companies have been trying to figure out like what to do with this information. And their sophistication has, I would say, evolving. And what makes it very exciting to me as a professor, I've had the good fortune of working with some companies that they're trying to get their heads around what to do in this space, is essentially what a company has in front of them is a lot of information they can use in a variety of different ways. Some of them, we'll set some guidelines around it. For example, we want to use the data that we have in front of us to serve our customers better. And then they have a whole series of questions that would flow from that. Right? We have all this information. How do we figure out like what inside this information is of useful? How can we better serve our customers? And what they're basically doing is they often start off with a series of questions that they want to ask, like how could we come up with more revenue, or how can we increase product quality using data? And many of them, without realizing it, they basically were operating as scientists. And they basically have the same kind of problems where they basically start and they have like a question called a hypothesis. And they want to turn to the data and see if their hypothesis has legitimacy or not. Yeah. And if they use unsophisticated techniques to analyze that data, they're probably going to get an answer, but that answer might be fundamentally wrong and send them down the wrong path. The companies that have really gotten their head around both the opportunity and the challenges of interpreting data have realized that they basically are running data science operations, hence the word science. And what they're doing resembles almost exactly what a modern statistician does as a professor on a university campus. You have hypotheses, you have experiment design, you have methodology. If you use the wrong methodology, you'll get the wrong answer, you'll make an investment, you'll lose money. If you're a physician studying a particular drug and you use the wrong methodology, maybe you'll kill your patient, right? It's the same kind of issues. And so I've given talks to business groups that are trying to grapple with these issues, and I'll give them the same, basically very similar introductory talk to research methodology that I give to my PhD students. Here's a series of methodologies that are basically out there. These different types of methodologies will help you answer certain kinds of questions. No methodology is perfect. If you hire a data scientist to head up this operation, the skills in a certain area, then you're going to be missing skills in another area. And I basically coach them and teach them how to manage their data science team, which is very similar to like how I manage, my team of researchers and postdocs on campus. Because if they're not careful and they're not, they don't have the tools themselves to understand like how to probe the right questions, how to see if their team is basically like heading down a track that's might not be productive, they can spend all this money and get nowhere.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot that's happening now where people have these data science teams and are not getting the value from it because they haven't fully embraced the fact that they're basically running scientific operations that benefit from thinking like a scientist.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, it's that application that whether it blows up in your face or you need to change the methodology that you're speaking to, until that happens, it's all just conjecture. And so I love the point of merging those two, and especially for companies, they got to weigh those risks of, if we go this path and we spend $5 million on it and it blows up in our face, is that a risk we can take based on our financials right now? And if it is, what's the reward from it? So I love thinking about that. And even to our previous guest, Dr. Raj says we're all scientists and should be questioning ourselves and the way we think as well as the way we go about business. So
that's right.
It's a lot of fun.
But it's a tremendously exciting time with some high fidelity experiences. So, as a professor, many professors can have a very illustrious career. Well, they'll design a series of studies and then they'll write up their findings in a paper, and they'll analyze and see whether X causes Y, for example. They could spend an entire career involved in that kind of process, be doing legitimate scientific work, and be contributing to society and our understanding of does X cause Y. A business person who's also curious about the same relationship will start off in the same way, perhaps. They'll use data science to try and get an understanding does X cause Y, right? But then they have to take the next step, which is, okay, if X causes Y, I'm going to act on that. And by acting on that, sometimes they'll learn that their initial study design had some fundamental missing variable that actually blows everything up, and maybe X doesn't cause Y in a way that we really thought it would. Yeah. And so to some extent, a business person that's really engaging with data science in a fundamental way is as much of a scientist as an academic that's out there just writing these papers. But what's different is they feel the pain. They have this high fidelity relationship with the data in the outside world that sometimes academics are insulated from. And so for me, that's what makes this an incredibly exciting time, is that there are more people that are realizing that if we get that right, that our company's going to be better off. And if we don't get that right, our company's going to feel some pain, especially when we're competing against other companies that might be getting it right. And it's a fantastic time to be thinking about data.
And then the question is, then can you deal with that pain, right? Because I think about that, and I've talked about that as whether it's new entrepreneurs or new advisors that are thinking about hiring, whether it's the next person or the first person. If you get the hire right, what does that do for your business? If you take a 3-month bet and you get the hire wrong, you're potentially out, let's say, $15,000. But can you live with that consequence? Can you make that business up to potentially have the reward of exponential amount? And so it's betting on yourself and betting on maybe your hypothesis and making a calculated bet versus just throwing a caution to the wind.
Right.
So. All right, let's go to lightning round because I want to be respectful of your time. So quicker answers here. Excuse me. Biggest struggle entrepreneurs face today?
I think it's focus. That a lot of entrepreneurs I work with are incredibly creative people. They have lots of ideas. And really you get rewarded as an entrepreneur from focusing on an idea and staying focused on that and seeing if you can make something of it. There's an art because sometimes it's time to pivot. But focus, I find, is something that a lot of really creative entrepreneurs really struggle with. This is different from a venture capitalist, where a venture capitalist has not only the luxury, but the assignment to think about a lot of different businesses and to not say necessarily completely focused in one little box. But for entrepreneurs, it's this issue of focus.
Love that answer. I thought you were just going to say it because I told you I was ADD ahead of time. But no, I actually really agree with you. Most important thing a startup should have locked down when approaching VC, venture capital?
I'm actually a very big fan of people talking to investors early so they can get advice. It's careful. You need to be careful about what you do with the advice, because sometimes investors will tell you, especially professional investors, that something won't work. And back to earlier discussion about data, you should ask yourself very carefully about what kind of information is available to that person when they're making that kind of assessment. They might be very smart, but they might be stepping beyond the data. And so I think it's very beneficial to talk to investors earlier, especially way ahead of before you needed financing, because they're very experienced business people. And if they're good investors, they're going to want to talk to you because they're in the business of trying to find smart people to work with. The one thing I do think it's important for entrepreneurs to think about, though, is their commitment. And they don't necessarily have to be 100% committed to their idea when they're starting. There's actually some research that shows that those people that have a job and then quit their job for their business that they've already started, that those companies turn out better than people who quit a job and then come up with an idea and start a business, and it's probably feeding back into opportunity cost. But having said that, it's their own commitment and interest in entrepreneurship. They should have that sorted out before they start talking to investors, because if they're not really serious about it, a disastrous situation is when someone gets a company off the ground, they've secured outside investment, and then they walk away, they give up because they get interested in something else. And I've seen it happen, and it doesn't do well for their reputation as an entrepreneur, and it also is obviously quite painful for the investors.
Yeah, I can imagine. So should entrepreneurs identify a problem or a niche first?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what we mean by that question is really, are they going towards more of what they're interested in and should go follow, these old quips out there, follow your bliss, follow your passion, versus uncovering a problem that might exist in society or technology or whatever it might be, and following their entrepreneurial skill set there?
So I went to a talk about 2 years ago on our campus, and this very successful entrepreneur said, look, people will tell you that you should follow your passion. You should start a company that's based on something that you really enjoy working on. And he said, that's ridiculous. He said, what you need to do if you want to be a successful entrepreneur is find something that other people need solved, and that's your path to being successful. I think there's a great, slight modification of that is if you can find something that needs to be solved that you really love thinking about. That's a beautiful,
magic.
That's a beautiful moment, and it's hard to keep working on something that you don't want to work on. But I think that a lot of people that go into entrepreneurship fully focused on problems of their own interest, and you're not focused enough on customers and serving their needs, that they might have a lot of fun, but they're going to be challenged as far as building a sustainable business.
Great point. Most important class a student should take for business that most do not?
Well, it's hard for me to know what they don't take, but
you guys don't have data on that?
Well, we do have. Well, that's a great question. So I should turn to the data and look at that. So my colleagues are going to laugh about that. Very good. So I'd say that there's a couple things that people should focus on. One is that I strongly advocate for class in accounting, that people need to have a good understanding of the language of business, how to record profit and loss, and the fundamental basics of that, because in the end, when you're framing up a business, that's the primary thing you have to deal with. An accounting class that's focused on managerial accounting, which gets into the issues of like cash flow management, which is fundamentally important for an entrepreneur to know, is I think incredibly useful. The second course I think it's very helpful for someone that wants to engage in entrepreneurship is actually an entrepreneurship class that's focused on not on business planning, but if you only have one class to take, it should really be about learning how to apply science to solving the problems that an entrepreneur faces. The most popular version of this is something called the Lean Startup, which was developed by a former entrepreneur and adjunct professor named Steve Blank. Eric Ries helped him with that as well, and a gentleman named Osterwald in Europe. And they basically come up with a framework that says an entrepreneur is facing a world of unknowns, and their task is to identify the key unknowns that are at risk or that are going to drive their success, and for the least amount of money as possible to try and produce information about those unknowns so they know what to do next. And so it's in the early stages of the company, what it's about is not about hitting financial metrics. It's about hitting knowledge metrics. You're trying to figure out, does this thing work? Are there people that are going to eat the dog food? That meaning, are there customers that are going to want to buy this product? You're exclusively focused on that, and you're not focused on building a business in the sense that you're not focusing on building a business organization. So many entrepreneurs make the mistake, and they say, okay, like if I'm going to build a company, I need to hire a marketing person, I need to hire a finance person, I need to build out this team, and then we're going to go execute. And for reasons why you learn in this class, that's a higher risk way of approaching the problem.
That's good. I'm not answering the questions, but my answer would be a personal finance class because it's something that everyone needs to have a basis on. Best resource in Madison for entrepreneurs or people thinking about starting their own businesses?
We're incredibly fortunate that there are lots of different organizations here that are very high quality. And so I'm going to mention several as far as places to turn. So I think if you're a faculty entrepreneur on our campus, start with that, or a student entrepreneur, there's several organizations you must get in touch with. One would be the Law Entrepreneurship Clinic on our campus. They provide free legal advice. You don't say anything more?
Free
legal advice on how to set up your company. The work that they have done has been is quite high quality. I've talked to entrepreneurs that have built great businesses on top of their work, and it stood up quite well. Another is the Wired Center for Entrepreneurship, which I ran until recently. This is an operation that provides a lot of training to entrepreneurs. It's good to get some of this training. There's lots of people that have not been able to take the classes, but they've sat in, people that are tied to the campus in some way. So they basically learn how to get off the ground and get plugged in to the network. There's a DDP program which operates inside the campus and helps entrepreneurs tied to the campus vet their ideas and figure out what the next stage might be. And then there's the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, which is our tech transfer office, which makes it sound like you go in there and you kind of sit down and then like you have your teeth cleaned or something like that. That's not what they're doing at all. They have a team of they have a lot of resources. They have a new venture officer who works there, Mike Parched. And they also have a lot of experienced attorneys, world-class. They can help you understand what IP issues you might have before you get started, which is really important for faculty entrepreneurship. Outside the school, we have many doors into our startup community, so to speak. There is the Spark building, where Starting Block is located, is a great place to start. Essentially, this is focused for folks that are not as affiliated with the campus, but they are very happy to work with students. We have many students that are there. Inside that building, you'll see literally floor after floor after floor of resources available to entrepreneurs. Starting Block being kind of like the nonprofit organization in the middle of that that's tasked with connecting people in our community. There's a Generator Business Accelerator, which runs a variety of programs for entrepreneurs at all stages, including something called G Alpha and G Beta, which literally is for people that are really excited about potentially becoming an entrepreneur. This might be the way to think about it, and they're committed to going down that path. I'm going to pause for a second here, and I'm sure I'm missing some other groups. Oh, I should also mention that there's a large number of investment groups. Wisconsin Investment Partners, Venture Investors is another one. HealthX. There's Rock River Capital. There's lots of different investment groups that, if you're an entrepreneur just starting out, these are experienced people. They know what they're doing. 30 Ventures is another one. I'm sorry, I forgot that one. If you just have a chat with them, many of them are more than willing to give you some advice to help you get off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, in summation, what's so exciting about our times right now and what you're referencing is there's no shortage of resources where there might have been 20, 40 years ago. Right now, you have everything that you just said on campus, off campus. We have the internet that you can utilize as resource. Right. So there's no excuse for your idea not to come to fruition. I think that would be my main message to any entrepreneur out there. So leverage these. All right, so the word game, told you about this. One word answers or maybe short phrase, just can't repeat yourself. Ready?
Well, this is obviously an almost impossible task for a professor to complete.
I know, that's why
we
it's
have
so
a
fun.
Paragraph after each word, so I'll
and then
try
you've got to
limit
feel like you got to
myself one
explain
word.
yourself too. No explanation.
That's all right.
We just want your first word pops to your head. All right, freedom.
Entrepreneurship.
Risk.
Not entrepreneurship.
I love those answers. Money.
Opportunity.
Relationships.
Durable.
Ideas.
Future.
Education.
Opportunity. Oh, I can't use the same word twice.
We got a thesaurus for opportunity?
Yeah, we used opportunity before. We'll bet on yourself, maybe.
All right. Inspire or inspiration.
Other entrepreneurs.
Impact.
Knowledge.
Love it. All right. So I didn't tell you about this beforehand, but I'm just curious, being that I know you're so well read. Favorite book of all time or most recently read you'd like to share with the audience?
All right. So here I'm going to take a little bit of liberty and give you 3 books. All right. I'm professor.
This is where your professor
I'm
comes
professor. I'm just going to do that. All right. So the first one is a book called The Intelligent Investor, written by Benjamin Graham.
Yep.
And it's not a book for an entrepreneurship professor to highlight, but essentially, first off, if you do well as an entrepreneur, you're going to have to figure out what to do with your assets. And this is a great book to, and you're also probably self-motivated. This is a great book to think about how to make investments. What I particularly like about this book is there's a section in there, a chapter on the psychology of markets, which in one short chapter really helps you understand, I think, maybe not the right way, but a way that at least resonates with me about how to think about finance in the world that you're operating in. The next book, more tied to our theme around data science, is a book called Prediction Machines, written by a bunch of economists. Their names are Ajay Agrawal, Joshua Gans, and Avi Goldfarb. If you're thinking about how to apply data science to business, I think this is a phenomenal book. It really changed my thinking, and one of the favors they do for us all is they provide a framework, like it or not, on how to understand both the advantages of machine learning and those kinds of technologies, but then also where those technologies might stop as far as things that they can't do for us. And it's a great way of thinking about, especially those that are investing in data science, what you should be doing and maybe what you shouldn't be doing when you're thinking about how to make decisions based on data science. And the third book, a little bit of a tangent here, is a book called More from Less. And I like books that make me think differently than maybe I would be thinking before I read the book. The author, I think, is Tom McAfee. And the thesis of this book is this, is he basically says that if you think about how economies function, we're essentially efficiency machines. We try and produce more stuff using less resources, because that's how companies make profits, right? You reduce your costs and you have like more revenue, meaning you're shipping more stuff out the door. As a result of that, that's a highly functioning capitalistic economy produces more outputs while using lower inputs. That's the thesis of his book, and he's really speaking to environmental economists and people that are concerned about the impact that humans have on the planet. And an argument is that at a baseline, this is happening, and if you look at the more mature economies, we're consuming more using less resources. He then talks about situations where this is failing, it doesn't really work. Talks about, for example, air pollution, and maybe some of the next best solutions to dealing with some of those problems, given that the more from less model isn't going to really function to address those problems. But it's a great book as a reminder of how people think about. A lot of people look at the economy and they say, "Oh my gosh, there's like all this stuff being produced, like we're using up the planet." And he gives you a framework to think maybe a little differently about some of these issues.
Oh, it's really good. So I can only co-sign one of those 3 books, which is Intelligent Investor, figure as a financial advisor. Coincidentally, I gave a sophomore student, football player, an interview because I had a great conversation with him. He said he read that book as a freshman.
Outstanding.
And I was so impressed and blown away, by his maturity and just choosing to read that outside of school, which is because it's a hearty book for those that have not read it or potentially thinking about reading it. Go to that chapter you referenced, but yeah, if you want to get through that book, it's going to take you a while. But tremendous read, I agree. So how can our audience get in touch with you if need be and your wealth of knowledge?
Well, if you go to the Wisconsin School of Business and you search for my last name, Eckhart, Eckhardt, in our faculty directory, like my email, phone number, everything pops up right there on the screen. Perfect.
I think that anyone that's listening, hopefully we got some younger listeners that are going or thinking about going to school. I would love for you guys to get into Professor Eckhart's, no, I can call you John, but Professor Eckhart's classes in entrepreneurship, because I wholeheartedly believe in entrepreneurship. It's changed my life. I got it from my parents, and luckily I was able to see them as examples to be able to start my own businesses. But I know not all get to have that example in their lives, and your wealth of knowledge and the community that we have here in Madison, I think, is unprecedented. Maybe not unprecedented, but I love it, and I know you respect and love it as well. So love to see more and more entrepreneurs coming to Madison, staying in Madison, and making this community even better than it already is.
Well, thank you very much, Josh. My students call me John, so please call me John as well. And there's really no better time to be an entrepreneur.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge with all of us today. I really appreciate you.
Great, thank you.